welcome, everybody. Hello and welcome to Cross-Examination, a public primary debate between the candidates seeking Oklahoma Republican Party's 2018 nomination for Attorney General. Tonight we have three GOP candidates with us. Current Attorney General Mike Hunter on your House right. Then in the middle, Glenpool Public Defender Angela Bonilla, and Pawnee County or Hominy Attorney Gentner Drummond, closest to me. My name is Trace Savage. I'm the editor-in-chief of nondoc.com. We're an independent journalism publication based here in Oklahoma City. We are proud to present tonight's debate with a host of nonpartisan partners. Let's Fix This, a nonprofit led by Andy Moore that promotes voter involvement in Oklahoma, and Generation Citizen, a national organization with a local chapter that encourages civic engagement among young people. Tonight's debate is also made possible thanks to several financial sponsors. They have some of the reserved seating up here in the front. If I listed the descriptions of all these great organizations, we wouldn't have time to hear from the candidates, so I'm just going to name them real quick. Chubbuck, Duncan, and Roby, Crow and Dunlevy, Foshi and Yaffe, Fulmer Sill, the Oklahoma Association of Defense Counsel, the West Law Firm, Continental Resources, and OK Wind Power. We sat them close to each other. I think that was appropriate. But no, seriously, the fact that we have a diverse group of sponsors for tonight's debate, as well as a diverse group of attendees, I think shows the demand that there is for public, fair, accountable debates where we can have TV ads and radio ads and hopefully internet ads showing us information about the candidates, but at the end of the day, the public wants to hear from candidates directly and answer some fair, although sometimes maybe tough, questions. So that's our goal tonight. I want to thank also the Tower Theater, which has been a great partner in doing these debates, and this is a wonderful facility that sits 1 mile west of the Attorney General office here in Oklahoma City. So thank you so much to the Tower. Appreciate it very much for what you're allowing us to do. Before we start, I also want to mention that Mr. Mark Miles is a Democrat who is seeking this office as well. He'll be on the November ballot against whoever prevails in this GOP primary. We certainly do intend to host general election debates. It's a goal of ours for all the reasons I just articulated. So if we can get strong support and continue to see positive feedback, we certainly want to do that. Also, just one quick reminder, please silence your cell phone, limit your applause a little bit, and please, let's not make a lot of audible comments during the debates. There is a cash bar, tip your bartender well, but don't let that get you to yelling at the candidates. They all went to law school, and I bet they have better comebacks than most of us, although maybe not the front row down here, right? So we have some timekeepers in the front. I want to thank them for being here as well. I'm going to explain tonight's format. We have 2-minute opening statements from each of the candidates. We drew numbers just a minute ago, and so we know the order they're going to be going in, and they are going to have 3 rounds of questions after those 2-minute opening statements. The first round of questions will be 1-minute answers each for each question. The second round, we're going to expand that a little bit to 2 as we get down into some of the details and expand upon that. And then in the third round, we're going to go with 1 minute. We're going to see how much time we have as we kind of get there for those answers. If there is, and then we're going to have 2-minute closing statements as well. If there is any back and forth that seems to need to be expanded upon, I'm going to try to manage that a little bit and let us have a debate. This isn't a forum. We don't open this up and throw a microphone in the audience. We've worked with the journalists here to prepare these questions, and we want to have some good back and forth between the candidates. With that, let's meet those journalists. Stage far left, house right up front, is Aaron Brilbeck, a political reporter for KWTV News 9. News 9 is streaming this on news9.com. Aaron covers the Oklahoma State Capitol during the legislative session and has covered stories of national importance across the country during his career. Thank you so much for Griffin and News 9 streaming this, making it available for more people across the state in the statewide election. Just a quick aside, NonDoc, N-O-N-D-O-C, our Facebook page is also broadcasting this on Facebook, so share that if you want more people to see this debate this afternoon. Next to Aaron is Brianna Bailey, as a reporter for The Frontier, an online publication based in Tulsa that's readfrontier.org. She previously worked for The Oklahoman, and she holds a bachelor's degree in journalism from the University of Oklahoma. And then last, James Coburn is a reporter for the Edmond Sun and an inductee in the Oklahoma Journalism Hall of Fame. He's also an excellent poet, writes some wonderful historical poems looking at Oklahoma and some of our past, and we have the privilege of publishing those on nondoc.com. Like I said, we drew numbers to see who will give the opening statements. That'll be the same order for their closing statements. And we drew Mr. Drummond will go first, followed by Mrs. Bonilla, followed by General Hunter. So we have 2 minutes each. With that, let's go ahead and hear from Mr. Gentner Drummond.
Thank you very much, Trace. And for the sponsors and those participating today, thank you for being here. I'd like to recognize my wife, Wendy, who's been here through thick and thin with me and promoted me. Madeline, one of our daughters, with her husband Connor, and my brother David, who flew in from Florida to help out. I'm Gentner Drummond. Grew up in Osage County, in the middle of nowhere, 7 miles to my nearest neighbor. Graduated from Hominy High School. Went to Oklahoma State and then served in the military. Ended up being a combat fighter pilot during Gulf War and studied law. Came back to Oklahoma, where I began as a baby prosecutor and then a civil practitioner. For the last 23 years, I've practiced aggressive law, building companies, employ about 500 employees, and run numerous companies. Oklahoma has an opportunity. This is a crossroads during this election cycle. We have observed and lived through 10 years of failed leadership. We are now at a point where we can pick status quo and continue along that path, or choose a new leader and a new direction to bring Oklahoma back into the 21st century. My background in the military, ranching, business, and law provides that alternative. I appreciate your attendance today and your vote next Tuesday.
Thank you very much. Ms. Bonilla, 2
Thank
minutes
you.
to you.
I'm Angela Bonilla. My own journey has been met with struggle and adversity, and it's molded me into the woman that you see standing before you today. I had struggled in growing up, and I was married by the age of 18. 7 years later, I was divorced with small children. I had to make a decision to do something better for my life, for my children's sake, and for my sake. I decided to go to college, and while in college, I survived off of student loans, along with government and Cherokee assistance. I went to NSU to get my bachelor's degree in criminal justice with a paralegal emphasis because at that time I wanted to become a paralegal. However, I was taken to court to fight for the protection of my youngest child, and while in court I had to represent myself. I could not afford one. This opposing counsel had threatened to fight me and take all of my kids if I didn't agree to their list of demands. I stood my ground, I had my voice heard, and I protected my child. And that's when I decided that I was going to become an attorney so I could be a voice for the voiceless and the powerless. After I attended the University of Tulsa College of Law, I became a Tulsa public defender. Later, I was asked to be an attorney for Oklahoma Indigent Defense in Okmulgee County, and I continue to be the voice for the voiceless, the powerless, and the impoverished. I fought long and hard to get where I am today, and I will continue to fight for Oklahoma. I will serve Oklahoma with integrity, with transparency, and with understanding. Thank you.
Attorney General Hunter, your 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Savage. Hello, everyone. Appreciate y'all coming out. You know, the last time I introduced my wife, Cheryl, as my wife of 37 years, she said, if you do that again, I'm going to throw my shoe at you. So I think the rules of the debate are going to preclude you from doing that maybe next time. Cheryl, my lawyer, and she's also my security detail today. My daughter-in-law, Rachel, is here with her husband, Barrett, who's also an attorney. You know, I used to be the second best lawyer in my household next to Cheryl. Now I'm third. It's humbling. I also want to take just a second to introduce a couple of heroes of mine. Reggie Witten and Judge Mike Burridge are here. They're the lead counsel for the state in the opioid litigation, which we are battling through, if you will. I grew up on a farm just outside of Waukomis. I want to contradict Mr. Drummond. He said that he grew up in the middle of nowhere. I grew up in the middle of nowhere. it's important, I think, to understand that as the prospective nominee of the Republican Party for this office, it's important to appreciate, understand the credentials of the respective candidates. So it's been my privilege to represent the people of the state in different public service ventures, whether it was the legislature back in the 80s when Republicans were a oppressed minority, whether it was working for Governor Keating as his Secretary of State, where we lowered taxes, passed right to work, got a handle on welfare, whether it was being at the Land Commission and dealing with the corruption there, fixing it, or my tours of duty here in the Attorney General's office for most of the last 3 years, where we undercovered and we got everybody to understand what was going on at the health department. I'll conclude. I'm sorry I went over. I look forward to the rest of the debate. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you to the candidates. I knew we'd have some disagreement. I didn't know it would first be about who's more in the middle of nowhere. So I appreciate those opening statements. We're going to go to the first round of questions. We've got 3 rounds. In this round, each candidate will get 1 minute for each question. We're going to start with Aaron Brilbeck asking a question of Mr. Hunter.
Attorney General Hunter, back in February of 2017, Governor Mary Fallin appointed you to serve the remainder of Scott Pruitt's term as Attorney General. What have you accomplished in this time, and more importantly, what have you learned about the job in this time?
I don't think that there's any more important position in state government than the Attorney General. The range of responsibilities in your portfolio varies with everything from representing ratepayers in rate cases to criminal prosecutions to the sometimes very challenging job of advising the legislature and the governor. We've been able to, for instance, put 24 child pornographers either off the street or in the process of prosecution. We've been able to enter into and conclude a negotiation with OG&E, which takes customers' rates down almost $80 million. We've been able to uncover corruption at the health department, at the public pension, police pension system, and we've been able to deal with it aggressively and decisively. So at the end of the day, my responsibility, our responsibility in this office is to keep you safe. And we do that in the ways that I just described. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Drummond, I'll ask you a similar question. What have you seen from Attorney General Hunter in the past 16 months?
With his appointment to the position by Governor Fallin, what I have observed is a lack of transparency and openness. I would say that it begins with the Tar Creek audit, which we as taxpayers paid for. He, for 5 months, fought to keep that private. For an inexplicable reason, on April 9, 2018, he released it. The journalists at the Oklahoman and at the Frontier explored a little bit deeper and saw that, in fact, the statute of limitations for the crimes committed in the state of Oklahoma occurred and ran on April 8. I find that inexplicable, unexplainable, and unforgivable. As it relates to the opioid contract and the litigation, while I support absolutely prosecuting the manufacturers, distributors, and the pill-pushing docs eventually, I think the way in which that contract was awarded to the gentleman in the third row was wrong. There's no cap. Mr. Hunter said he anticipates $1 billion recovery. That would mean Misters Burge and Witten would get about $115 million in attorney fees. I think that what needs to be done after my election is a renegotiating of that. Put a cap on it. These are reasonable men, and those dollars need to go back to the state of Oklahoma. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's go to Mrs. Bonilla, and then I'm going to let Attorney General respond to a couple of those things there. Ms. Bonilla, same question that Aaron had. What have you seen from the Attorney General office in the last 16 months or so?
Just recently, I'd have to agree with Mr. Drummond. I've seen a lack of transparency, not only in the Tar Creek audit, but also in the Daniel Holtzclaw appeal. There's a lot of secret hearings being held without Daniel Holtzclaw's appellate attorneys present. They were excluded from those hearings, which is ex parte, and I find that disturbing. I'm concerned about the statutes of limitations running on the Tar Creek audit. Also, I believe that we could find a way to toll that and be able to bring that back to life and see if there's some relief that we can get from the Tar Creek Superfund site. That's all I've got to say about that.
No problem. Thank you so much. If we hold our microphone a little closer, I think we'll get that good audio. Thank you so much. Mr. Hunter, let's give you a minute to kind of go over some of the stuff that was just said. We're going to get into all that later, believe me, but just a quick response there to what was said by those two candidates.
The facts are that I had nothing to do with the Tar Creek audit. A decision was made prior to me joining the Attorney General's office not to prosecute. When I became Attorney General, I had 2 new prosecutors, one a Democrat, one a Republican, look at the case thoroughly. They found no crimes. They found nothing chargeable. This idea that there's a statute of limitations issue is just a contrivance. With respect to the opioid litigation, these gentlemen, the lawyers who are working on this case, so they will either get 0 or they'll get what's in the contract. And the blended rate is going to ensure that they're likely to get less than 10% of whatever the award is. So these gentlemen are putting their firms, they're putting their futures on the line to represent you in these cases against these companies who've brought death and destruction on this state. And I'm proud to be involved with them as their co-counsel. We're going to win this lawsuit, and we're going to get the taxpayers' money back.
Mr. Drummond, do you want 30 seconds to kind of go back? Or Aaron?
Could you also address the Daniel Holtzclaw issue, please?
Happy to. There was recently a Court of Criminal Appeals opinion which completely justified our approach to this case. There were personnel records that the city of Oklahoma City was not providing to the public. We went to the judge. The judge required us to have an in-camera hearing. We had nothing to do with requiring an in-camera hearing. Anyway, this Court of Appeals opinion completely validated our approach to the case, and I'm happy to have the great criminal appeals division that we have. They represent the state proudly and heroically.
Mr. Drummond, any follow-up on that? Or
Nothing at this
we'll,
time.
we'll get back there. Ms. Bonilla, same to you? Okay. Just making sure we're doing as much fair time allowance as we can. Mr. Coburn, I believe you have the next question.
Mr. Drummond, the Attorney General's office, to be Attorney General, you don't necessarily have to be an attorney according to the Oklahoma Constitution, but as we know, it probably helps. What one case in your legal career can you draw from that prepares you for the role of Attorney General if elected?
Thank you for that question. I think that the role of Attorney General is multifaceted. I am a career attorney. I've tried over 50 jury trials, over 200 bench trials, managed over 2,000 pieces of litigation for which my opponent has piecemealed a few of those and poked me in the eye. So I think certainly being a skilled, complex litigator, former prosecutor adds value to that position. I think what also is significant to note is it's also a very important, significant position in the state of Oklahoma that has an inordinate amount of authority and power. And I think what we need is, and what I have, is the stamina, the ability to suggest to the legislators when they're headed in a direction that we know is wrong, to head them back. For example, when they went to Mr. Hunter and said, we're going to call this tobacco tax a fee, and he gave a sign-off and said, I can defend that. And in fact, when it was enacted and the Supreme Court looked at it, they said, no, the duck is really a duck. It's not a fee, it's a tax. You need an attorney general who has that ability to do that.
And Ms. Bonilla.
Just real quick, I'm sorry, Jay, I thought you were going to ask a follow-up. The question was, what one case, if you had to pick a case out of your legal career, what case would you point to as really preparing you to be Attorney General?
In a word, as probably a 2-year attorney, I prosecuted a child rapist, put him in jail for over 250 years. From a criminal prosecution case, that was the most significant. From a civil side, litigating complex litigation in South Dakota involving $300 million was very significant as well.
Thank you. Now,
Ms.
Ms. Bonilla.
Bonilla, same question. What in your past career best prepares you for the role of Attorney General if elected?
I have been a public defender since I graduated college. And everyone knows as a public defender, we have a massive caseload. I know how to juggle a massive caseload. I've gone to trial, numerous trials for murders to petty larceny. I have a huge diversity because I took on a role as a public defender. You're not afforded the freedom to choose your clients, you're appointed to them. So in spite of that, I represent all of my clients zealously and provide them with the greatest defense they have. That coupled with my life experience, I believe I can do the job of Attorney General in a handle it in a respectful manner and also do a great job.
Mr. Hunter?
Did you say a case, though?
He didn't specifically ask for a case.
Right, well, I am. So what would be a case that really prepared you?
I don't know. I think every case has different facts, different circumstances, different legal issues. I think every case molded me to become the attorney I am today.
Thank you. Mr. Hunter?
Well, I regret that Mr. Drummond's being provided with falsehoods by his handlers, but I advised the Oklahoma legislature just the contrary with regard to the cigarette fee. I advised that it was a tax and the Supreme Court was going to treat it like a tax. I was just in a conversation with Representative Tim Downing the other day, and he recalls I called him to caution him as a legislator. He handed the phone to Majority Leader John Eccles, and I advised John the day the bill passed that we weren't going to be able to defend it successfully. The case that I would point to would be Southwestern Bell versus Anthony. I was general counsel of the Corporation Commission when utilities sought to have Commissioner Anthony disqualified. It would have completely short-circuited the ability of the Corporation Commission to deal with rate cases. My arguments were to the Supreme Court that it's a legislative proceeding, and all the jurisprudence in the state supports that. We won that case, and that case has been cited in nearly 200 cases around the country since.
Thank you very much. Brianna, I believe you have the next question for Mrs. Bonilla.
Okay. In 2012, the Attorney General's office absorbed the Oklahoma Human Rights Commission, and it's now responsible for enforcing Oklahoma's anti-discrimination law and investigating complaints of racial profiling. Do you think that the AG's office is adequately enforcing the law in this area? And what, if anything, would you change about how the AG's office is currently handling these cases?
Ms. Bonilla.
Can you repeat that question?
Sure.
Sorry.
Okay. In 2012, the Attorney General's office absorbed the Oklahoma Human Rights Commission, and it's now responsible for enforcing anti-discrimination laws in Oklahoma and investigating complaints of racial profiling. Do you think the AG's office is adequately enforcing the law in this area? And what, if anything, would you change about how the AG's office is handling these cases?
I recall a case that we had in Tulsa County where a police officer, I think there were several of them that were pulling over Hispanics, asking them to leave their wallets in their cars, and then going and taking their money from their wallets and releasing them, singling out a race that has no voice. They are scared to report anything, and they took advantage of that. I'm not sure of the AG's involvement in that, but the officer was dealt with accordingly. A case was filed against him, and he was prosecuted. I'd like to see more of that occur in the statewide. I think nobody's above the law, whether it's the police officers or other individuals that are committing this discrimination.
Okay, Attorney General Hunter, same question. Oh, yes.
I'm really proud of the Civil Rights Enforcement Division in the AG's office. Our chief, Kara Smith, is a recipient of the Ada Lois Sippuel Award. Her leadership in that division has been just this side of splendid. We've taken the approach that it's important to enforce, but it's also important to sensitize and educate. So we have an annual seminar in which we provide guidance and advice to both the private and public sector with regard to how to comply with the civil rights laws in Oklahoma. We also are in the process of putting together a tutorial for state government that will be the magnetic north for how to avoid sexual harassment in state government.
Mr. Drummond, the same question to you, sir.
We in Oklahoma, we have a rich heritage that we are proud of. We also have segments of our society who have suffered discriminatory acts since our statehood. I think that we have a robust civil rights protection division presently in the Attorney General's office, and I think the Attorney General needs to be continually on guard and aware of the possibility of us lacking in any certain areas. So that's a key component to the Attorney General, which I think will continue to be in the future.
Thank you very much. That's the end of round one. Quickly, let's get a little air in the room. Just give a round of applause, everything like that. I feel like my warning maybe terrified everybody. You know, I'm a little tight-knit. The state's next top law enforcement person's right here, so I don't want to get crossways with anybody. But let's have a lively time here and go on to round two. We're going to get deep into a case that was already brought up concerning the state's suit against opioid manufacturers. Aaron, you have the first question. This time it will go to Mr. Drummond, and we're going to expand these answers to 2 minutes each as we get down into this controversial case that has been brought up.
Mr. Drummond, you've criticized Attorney General Hunter for how he's handled the opioid lawsuit. You've accused him of cronyism and of what you have referred to as rookie mistakes. Do you support the lawsuit itself, or do you believe the case should be disposed of?
You've asked a direct question for which I'm going to give you an answer, but you also have touched on several things. As it relates to the continuation of the case, it is fundamentally in the best interest of Oklahoma to continue to zealously prosecute this case. And I have no criticism of Judge Burrage or Mr. Whitten's legal skills. They are highly qualified attorneys and they're co-counsel from Texas. My criticism is in the lack of transparency in the awarding of that contract. I think if there is no requirement at law for the Attorney General to do an RFP for outside services. However, it's in the best interest of the state. And I think had there been some free market capitalism at play with negotiating between certain law firms that are certainly qualified, that fee would have been capped. It's not capped. I anticipate after my election they'll be glad to cap it, and we'll cap it. Why? Because that extra $75 million that would otherwise go to them should go to Oklahoma for drug rehabilitation, mental health, and other remedial activities inside the opioid epidemic. So that's profound. As it relates to the criticism I recently made, I've litigated complex litigation, and I know these gentlemen are skilled. I also know they have attorneys who work for them. And in this particular instance, there was an invoking of federal law in a response to interrogatories, which gave the pharmaceutical companies that little hook to try to remove it to federal court. If they are successful, this case will be tried in Ohio in front of a federal court, not in Oklahoma in front of jurors. That was a mistake. I have confidence that they'll be able to overcome that. They should, and they will. Thank you.
If I could just follow up then, you kind of pointed out there is no RFP required. Why are we making it an issue?
Why is there no RFP?
No, there is no RFP required. Attorney General Hunter chose who he thought would be the best person within compliance of state law. Why make this an issue?
There are many things that are permissible at law, but many things in best practices we should do in addition. Specifically, as something as this, and Mr. Hunter would agree with me, this is the most profound litigation for the state of Oklahoma in the last 15 years. It should have had an RFP. It should have been competitively bid, and we should have gotten the very best price for Oklahomans, not rewarding the gentlemen who maximized their contributions within 30 days of signing the contract. That smells.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Bonilla, same question. Do you support the lawsuit, or do you believe it should be disposed of?
I commend Mike Hunter for following through with this suit. We do have an opioid epidemic that needs to be addressed, and in dealing with my clients and in dealing with the criminal law aspect for a while, I've known this for quite some time, and he's finally taken the stand. The one that I wanted to take a stand against is the manufacturing companies and also holding doctors liable for overprescribing medications. As Mr. Drummond has stated, we have investment going on with this suit, the state of Oklahoma does, and I agree, we do need to channel that fund into addressing mental health issues, substance abuse issues. However, because we have such high stakes in this, I really think that we need to give the Attorney General discretion in order to make that decision to hire the proper people who will more likely guarantee, hopefully, successful outcome of this case. My clients deserve someone speaking on their behalf in regards to this opioid fight. And if my country chooses these specific lawyers to do so, I support them in that, and I will see that it's carried on if I'm elected as Attorney General.
Just to follow up, if I may, if you are elected, did I hear you right that you would consider going after doctors who overprescribe?
Yes, because they are our last defense to our health. We don't have that medical degree, and we depend on our doctors to prescribe medications that we know or are at least safe for us. I recently had a bulging disc issue in my neck, and the first thing that I was prescribed was Lyrica, which I find to be, I don't have pain, and I'm still being prescribed pain medication, which I find offensive. I think that we need to protect the public.
Thank you, ma'am. Attorney General Hunter, do you believe that if elected, your two opponents will pursue this as aggressively as you have?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball, but, past is prologue. I've been disappointed and maybe bewildered by the criticism of our lawyers in this lawsuit. It seems to me that given the stakes, that the last thing anybody should want to do is to aid and abet or in any way encourage the defendants in this lawsuit. I don't know if you've seen the 60 Minutes pieces on opioid manufacturers. Don't know if you saw the CBS News report earlier this week. As much as I hate to say it, and as hyperbolic as it sounds, these entities are, in effect, evil, and they have done great damage to the state. The chicanery that we've had to deal with in this lawsuit, the unprofessionalism, the deceit, we had a contract with these companies that stipulated that they would not challenge state jurisdiction. And on the flimsiest of excuses, they filed a motion of notice of removal to go to federal court. The federal judge acted in our judgment. She acted hastily. There are motions to reconsider. We're confident we'll get this case back on track in state court in Cleveland County. We're going to hold these companies accountable for the death and destruction that they've brought on this state. I want an Oklahoma jury to hear this evidence, and I want a verdict from an Oklahoma jury in this case, not some far-off, smoke-filled room in Columbus, Ohio, with a bunch of plaintiffs' attorneys from all over the country who don't have Oklahoma's interests at heart.
Just to clarify, though, do you believe that your two opponents will enforce that as aggressively as you are in terms of not just litigation, but also moving it from federal to local?
I have optimism in the basic goodness of both my opponents.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Do they allow smoking in courtrooms in Ohio? I'm not sure. Mr. Drummond, I'm good at reading faces. I think you wanted just to reply.
I
30
just have
seconds
to,
real quick.
Certainly. I just have to rebut one thing that Mr. Hunter said. I agree that the pharmaceutical companies are the evil empire. Only one of us on this stage have accepted money from pharmaceutical companies, and it's Mr. Hunter. When it was called out, he gave it back. But he's also one of 37 attorneys general who are members of RAGA. And RAGA funded $400,000 into this state against my campaign. And RAGA is one of RAGA's primary fundraising groups is pharmaceutical companies. So in effect, the pharmaceutical companies that Mr. Hunter speaks ill of are funding his campaign for Attorney General.
Mr. Hunter, I'm going to let you respond to that. Ms. Bonilla will let you get word in too as well. But Attorney General Hunter, do you want to reply to any of the statements that were made there?
So, in a word, I would say nonsense. I have not accepted money from pharmaceutical companies. There were checks that came in. Once we identified those checks that had come in, we returned them. RAGA has set up an entity which is assisting in my campaign. There's no coordination going on. The contributions that they're receiving, I have no control over. I don't know where they're coming from. So to speculate that there's money coming into my campaign from pharmaceuticals is just wrong and there's no evidence to substantiate that. So that is, for the record, not true, and it's unfortunate that remark was made.
Other than it is public record and it's clear on its face that there are 10 pharmaceutical companies who've given over $200,000 to RAGA that has funded $400,000 into the state of Oklahoma.
You have a microphone if you feel.
Again, Mr. Drummond is, well, I won't say again, but he's mixing apples with oranges. We have no idea where the funding is going to the group that's been set up by RAGA. I have no control over it. It's not being coordinated. So the idea that you can speculate where the funding's coming from, again, is unprofessional and unwarranted.
Mr. Hunter, that is a lie.
Well, we'll get into this a little more.
Excuse me?
I believe he said you'd lied, so I don't know. Is that what you said, sir?
I said that's a lie. He knows that.
Well, I think that we should all conduct ourselves as chief law officers of the state, whether we are or not.
Okay. At the tail end of that, Ms. Bonilla, we owe you a little bit of time, 30 seconds if you'd like to comment. I think that you probably have raised the least money from various interests involved. So what might you say in that regard?
I think we need to stop with this smokescreen here. The real problem is the opioid epidemic, and we just need to focus on that.
Thank you very much. I do have a question on this case as well. We're kind of going out of order a little bit. I circled it on my thing. I'm going to ask this of Mr. Drummond, and then all of you, I'd ask the same to answer as well. And I can't wait to get skewered by all the attorneys in the audience for my exact wording on this. But in tort cases, there are various causes of action that can be claimed by an entity. Fraud, deceptive practices, negligence, product liability, nuisance, those sorts of things. In this particular case, or maybe not this particular case, in general, when we're talking about the creation and distribution of opioids over the last decade or however long, what do you believe is the most relevant cause of action against any of those parties?
I think that the petition accurately lays out the different causes of actions against the manufacturer, but in layman's terms, what it is this. The manufacturers knew the opioids to be addictive, one, and two, that they would cause death or addiction. And it's that action, that flagrant disregard for the welfare of Oklahomans, that they need to be prosecuted to the highest extent of the law. As it relates to the doctors who overprescribe, they're not part of the litigation. They soon should be, or a separate litigation. There are well-meaning and excellent physicians who understand the addictive nature of opioids. My comment is not directed to them. But those who make a living pushing pills to the detriment of Oklahomans should be held accountable, and the legislature should put protocol into place so that we limit the ability for these doctors to exploit our citizens.
Do you think it's a different cause of action, though, on the physician's behalf than it is on the manufacturers?
Yes, it is. I think on the manufacturer, it's knowingly pushing an addictive substance that kills. On the doctors, it is overprescribing for personal gain.
Thank you very much. Mr. Hunter, same question to you, sir. You certainly filed the case, so I'm sure you have an opinion on what the most relevant causes of action are.
So the remedies available to the state are principally in the nature of the public nuisance that the oversupply of these drugs has created in the state. We, as the state, are able to advance joint and several liability against each of the defendants, which means that we can hold each of the four 100% liable for all the damages. Again, the approach to this isn't just one lawsuit. The approach to this has got to be comprehensive and holistic, and that's how we've approached it. Those of us who've been allies in the war against the epidemic for several years. Most notably, I would say that the commission that the legislature authorized for us to evaluate the problem and provide the state more tools was very successful. 7 of the proposals needed legislation, all 7 passed. And with respect to pill doctors, when we see people who are prescribers acting in reckless disregard for their patients' health, we've prosecuted them, as we did the Midwest City doctor who killed 10 of her patients effectively last summer, gave 4 of her patients 3,000 pills over a 1-month period. We've charged that individual with 5 counts of second-degree murder. When we see prescribers who are functioning as drug dealers, we're treating them that way.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Bonilla, same question to you concerning causes of action on these matters.
Well, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but Mr. Drummond and Mr. Hunter actually has made the same points that I would make. We just need to protect the public when it comes to this opioid epidemic and do it the right way, which I think we are moving forward in doing so.
Thank you. James, you have the next question. I believe it goes to Mrs. Bonilla as well, so keep that microphone on, Mrs. Bonilla.
Ms. Bonilla, it's fairly uncommon that the Attorney General would bring a civil liability action against private companies on behalf of the state of Oklahoma. Under what circumstances do you believe the state should pursue civil action against businesses?
The one civil action against businesses I would bring forward is in regards to ban the box. I would want the question of whether or not they're a convicted felon to be erased off any application. This gives my clients an opportunity to get their foot in the door. Now, I'm not saying that company actually has to hire the people that are convicted felons. It gives them an opportunity to present themselves in an interview and at least have a face-to-face where these companies are continuing to hire numerous people. They have the ability to weed out those people who wouldn't fit the job requirements. A lot of my clients are coming back before the courts because they're failing to abide by the rules of their probation, and most of these rules violations are monetary, such as failure to pay supervision fees, failure to pay fines and costs, or restitution, or anything in that matter. And the issue is they cannot find a job. And if they're not giving the opportunity to at least have a face-to-face contact with the employers, they're not getting an opportunity to abide by the rules and conditions of probation, and we're sending people back to prison based upon money. And last I checked, Oklahoma is not a debtor state.
Thank you. Mr. Hunter, your same question to you, sir, and Mr. Coburn can repeat it if you need it repeated.
It's fairly uncommon that the Attorney General would bring a civil liability action against private companies on behalf of the state. Under what circumstances do you believe the state should pursue civil action against businesses?
Ronald Reagan once observed that people do as much good as they can and as much bad as they have to. And I think this is probably a maxim that applies to companies, to businesses. Unfortunately, sometimes businesses do bad things. Sometimes great companies like VW, through whatever process internally, decide to defraud the public. So our office, as a service, as part of our responsibility to the people of the state who were damaged by the fraud that VW visited on consumers by pretending that emission controls were in place when they weren't. We sued VW, $8 million verdict. That money is going to be available for us to use to help fund our consumer protection unit. And I'm pleased to say our consumer protection unit, over the period of time that I've been AG, has recovered over $500,000 in restitution that we've been able to return to victims. So that's been a priority for me. Generally speaking, when businesses do bad things, as much as Republicans and free marketers hate it, we need to hold them responsible, and that's part of my responsibility as Attorney General.
Thank you. Mr. Drummond, same question to you, sir.
The Attorney General is the state of Oklahoma's attorney, and the state of Oklahoma's shareholders are its citizens. So when the shareholders need defense or prosecution on a global macro scale, it's the Attorney General that should do that. Litigation is very expensive. Anyone who's involved with it understands that. So where we have businesses that are wrong actors, the Attorney General, I believe, has a duty to right that wrong. Mr. Hunter brought up the Volkswagen settlement, and I'm going to use that as a segue on what the Attorney General can do with these recoveries. Presently, we have over 7,000 rape kits untested in Oklahoma. It would cost us about $3 to $4 million to test those. We owe it to those rape victims who have gone through a terrible experience from the rape to the test to have it evaluated and put it into the database. And although I'm respectful of the settlement, I think it should have been put toward the rape kit testing.
Thank you. Brianna, you have the last question of this round for Attorney General Hunter.
Okay, we already got into this a little bit. We're going to get back into it. But you've been criticized for selecting the Witten Law Firm to be co-counsel in the opioid lawsuit. Mr. Drummond and others have said you should have taken bids for the contract instead of unilaterally entering into an agreement with that firm. Have you ever bid out other contracts, and is it appropriate to strike a deal without taking other bids?
I had a hard time hearing the last part of your question.
Is it appropriate to strike a deal without taking other bids? Have you ever bid out other contracts?
I'm sorry, the last thing again. I'm sorry.
Have you ever bid out other contracts, and is it appropriate to strike a deal without taking out other bids?
When you have a personal services contract like this that is so incredibly unique, the idea that you can have a sterile request for proposals and have that process be productive is really just unrealistic. As we got into the middle of evaluating what the state's responsibilities were in the opioid epidemic, it was clear to me that we had to sue the opioid manufacturers. So my process was to look around the state, to talk to people who'd been leaders in dealing with the epidemic, and also to look at the attorneys that I was familiar with and the law firms that were going to have the bandwidth to be able to invest the hundreds of thousands of dollars that they were going to have to invest to prosecute this lawsuit. So when I was the chief negotiator on the Choctaw and Chickasaw water settlement litigation, Judge Burridge was on the other side. And I had never encountered a tougher, smarter, more articulate, more savvy attorney in all my years of practice. So, although we were on other sides of that litigation, the idea that I could look any farther than somebody who I was convinced was the finest lawyer in the state just didn't make any sense to me. So, when I talked to the firm and when I proposed to them that they should look at this, it was a decision, again, based on the best lawyers in the state. Just so happens that this law firm won the largest court judgment in the history of the state. So given their track record and given their commitment to the epidemic, both Reggie and Mike are victims of the epidemic. Reggie lost his son, Mike lost his niece. They had invested in dealing with this epidemic for years and years. So I knew we weren't just getting good lawyers. I knew we were getting lawyers who were going to pour their heart and soul into this case, and they were going to represent Oklahomans to the best of their ability.
I appreciate that.
I have
It sounded like you said that.
I don't think you answered the second part of the question, which was, do you typically bid out contracts for other litigation in other cases? Is that something that AG's office does?
We very rarely do outside retainers. Our position is we look at the skill sets of the firm, we look at the litigation, and we make judgments based on who the best firm is, based on our experience, based on feedback we get to handle the lawsuit.
Thank you.
Have you ever bid out another case, though, with I think there's a list, am I correct? Have you ever bid out other cases? You personally?
This is the only outside retainer we've done of this nature since I've been Attorney General.
Thank you. Mr. Drummond, I'm sorry about that, Brianna. I was trying to ask the same thing you were. Mr. Drummond, you have 2 minutes, same question.
I think what Mr. Hunter has identified is the problem with not being open and transparent. And my issue is not with Judge Burridge and Reggie Whitten. That's not my issue. My issue is when you look at the contract, the majority of the fees are going to a Texas law firm. So that tells me, as an Oklahoma lawyer, we don't have anybody in Oklahoma as qualified as the Texans. And the other problem I have with that contract is 10% of the fee goes to Glenn Coffey, who is basically just a middleman. And that, to me, is abusive of the process. Beginning in January of 2019, what this state will observe in the Attorney General's office is that every contract will be given the light of day. We will not have to go through a Freedom of Information request to discover what was negotiated in a smoke-filled room. It will be open and obvious. The best law firms will compete head-to-head to obtain the fidelity, the contract with the state of Oklahoma. And I, as your Attorney General, will ensure that it is fair and honest and open and obvious.
So you plan to bid all your outside contracts?
Absolutely. That's the way it should be. All other
100%?
agencies have to. All other responsible corporations in America do so. We will do so in the Attorney General's office.
Mrs. Bonilla, same question to you.
I agree with Mr. Drummond when he says that we need transparency, but also would like to send my condolences out to those who are affected with opioids. My daughter lost her father because of that. That's why this is very close to my heart. And if we have an opportunity to hold those accountable, then we need to hold those accountable regardless of where the firm is located. If the firm was located in Oklahoma, those fees would be going to Oklahoma attorneys, not the state of Oklahoma. We're trying to get the funds that we deserve in order to combat this opioid epidemic. Those funds we need to put towards mental health and substance abuse services. How we get there is dependent solely on the chief prosecuting attorney. He is the steward of his resources. And that's one of the things I take seriously, is being able to make sure that not only do we make the right choices, but do it in the best financial means possible.
Thank you. Mr. Hunter, Mr. Drummond said a dirty word, Texas. And so I wanted to see if you had any furtherance or statement about the Texas firm that is helping with that. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, I think they were involved in the tobacco settlement and have a track record of succeeding, although they have other track records as well. So what can you say about their involvement?
Well, the idea, given the complexity of this lawsuit, that we aren't going to repose trust and confidence in Mike Burridge and Reggie Whitten to assemble a team that has the bandwidth, that has the experience with this kind of litigation to take on multi-billion-dollar companies who've demonstrated that they're going to be cold-blooded and do anything to win these lawsuits. That's just not realistic. So I've placed my trust and confidence in their ability to put a winning law firm together. There are other law firms included. They have experience in this kind of complex litigation. We know what we're doing. And again, I just think it's unfortunate that while we are fighting these drug companies who've demonstrated that they have valued profits over patients for the last 20 years, to criticize this process while it's occurring is unfortunate.
Thank you. 15 seconds, either of you. Okay. Let's go to round three. If you didn't know, if you had 3 o'clock lunch plans, you might be a couple minutes late. We're looking forward to all the questions we have. We have round three, and I believe, Brianna, you have the first question here. We're going to go back to 1 minute answers on this round. Brianna, your first question is from Ms. Bonilla.
Okay, so on Tuesday, Oklahomans will decide on State Question 788, and if it passes, that would legalize medical marijuana. Where do you stand on the State Question 78? And if it passes, what would you do to implement the will of the people as well as protect the public?
I am personally voting for State Question 788. I believe that Oklahomans need to be afforded the right to have alternative treatment, whether it goes towards pain, anxiety, seizures. There's multiple ailments that it can help or alleviate some of the symptoms for. I think it would also alleviate a lot of the opioid epidemic that we have going on right now. I know that the licensing, it is for a person for 2 years, but they have to get the recommendation from a medical physician, and a medical physician does not include veterinarians. I've read the state question. I've actually talked to the man who has written it, and I've asked him numerous questions, such as regarding the amount. It seems like a huge, huge amount to be in possession of. And he stated it was for cancer patients, and it's a 30-day supply, so they took everything into account. I just ask that you research the state question itself and ask questions yourself. Thank you.
Mr. Hunter, same question to you, sir.
This state question has very little to do with medical marijuana. For those of you who are supportive of recreational marijuana in the state, this is mostly what you're going to get. My view of this proposition is that it's recreational marijuana light. The impact, the impositions that it's going to create on Oklahoma businesses are unmanageable. There is no requirement that you be under a doctor's care. There's no requirement that any kind of a prescription occur with regard to the use of marijuana under the law. The other train wreck that is about to occur is requiring the health department to regulate medical marijuana. Our involvement in the investigation of the health department with the state auditor causes me to report to you that the health department is in no position to regulate this. So, again, my position is, based on information, based on thorough review of the state question, that it is not medical marijuana. It is, in effect, recreational marijuana light.
Mr. Drummond, same question to you, sir.
As State Question 78 is drafted, it creates as many troubles as it opens up possibilities of advancing. I've spoken to many law enforcement personnel who have grave concerns about the impact of an affirmative vote on State Question 788. I've also talked to cancer victims, cancer survivors who have desperately wanted medical marijuana as a source of relief for pain. So I understand both sides of that argument. I think that the Attorney General will have to be forefront in the negotiation of the rules and regulations this is promulgated if it does pass. As Attorney General, I won't make law, but I will enforce law. And if it is passed, I will work with the legislature to make it feasible. If it fails, I will enforce the use of marijuana.
Thank you. Aaron, you have the next question, I believe, for Attorney General Hunter.
Yes, General Hunter, you caught some flack for not wanting to release an investigative audit concerning the alleged conspiracy to inflate expenses during the Tar Creek Superfund cleanup effort. Can you explain why you believe that audit requested by the AG during a criminal investigation should be held to a different open record standard than other audits conducted by the state auditor's office?
I didn't order the original audit. There was a lack of cooperation between my predecessor, the Attorney General, and the state auditor, which I regret, and I passed that along on numerous occasions to Mr. Jones. The investigative audit that by statute is allowed to be directed by the Attorney General to the auditor is just that. It's an investigative audit that allows us to understand the evidence, the facts around a possible crime. The decision that was made, and what I think as Attorney General I owe everybody, is if you are accused of something and there's an investigation and that investigation determines that you haven't done anything wrong, I've got the authority under law, the Attorney General does, to have the discretion to keep those files confidential. And so that was the principle that I was adhering to, that I was being faithful to, in being reluctant to let this Washington, D.C. group order the Attorney General's office around. Ultimately, it became such a distraction, I went to the multi-county grand jury judge and asked for leave to release the audit. It included grand jury subpoenaed information, and until I was able to get his approval, we couldn't release it. So that allowed us to both release the audit as well as all the investigative material that prosecutors looked at to determine that there was no chargeable crime.
Mr. Drummond, your thoughts?
What the Attorney General doesn't say is he released that report to the defense attorneys. So the individuals who were being investigated got the benefit of reading the taxpayer-funded audit, but we as taxpayers did not. And I find his answer disingenuous. Unless it involves the safety and protection of Oklahoma, not the protection of political allies or whatever corruption might lie behind that, then the taxpayers deserve openness and honesty from the Attorney General 100% of the time.
Mrs. Bonilla, I'm going to come back to you, Mr. Hunter. Mrs. Bonilla, same question.
I read the audit, and at the end of the audit, there's before and after pictures. There's a list of things that were submitted for payment, and they received payment almost $9,000 to remove a house, and it had landfill fees attached to it. The before had no house on that land. The after still had no house on that land. And if anyone's telling me that no crime was committed, I cry unfair, untrue. That is not what's going on here. There was numerous monies paid out. One for the tearing down of the Mickey Mantle House that was actually moved to Commerce and is still standing to this day. $5,000 paid out for the removal of that house that was already removed and is still standing. I think that it needs to be looked into, because if we're hiding this from the public, what else is being hidden? I think we need to have transparency across the board in our government, period.
To Mr. Hunter, you had a response to that.
Again, I regret that Mr. Drummond's being given inaccurate information by his handlers. I had nothing to do with the commission of the audit. I had nothing to do with the oversight of the grand jury review, the grand jury subpoenas. I had nothing to do with the original review of the evidence, and I had nothing to do with the release of any of the evidence to defense attorneys. Those are the facts.
Mr. Drummond, I want to give you 30 seconds to talk about this as well. My question is whether, if I put myself in the shoes that somebody makes allegations against me, it is determined that charges are not going to be filed. I guess the question is, does there need to be a precedent set or in terms of releasing that audit to the public if it's determined that I did not commit a crime?
Mr. Hunter is standing behind Mr. Pruitt in his response, so whether it's Mr. Pruitt or Mr. Hunter, I'm not going to mince words with you. The fact is, for 5 months, he spent taxpayer dollars rejecting transparency and then opened it up. Had there been transparency and that audit was published, attorneys like Ms. Bonilla, like me, like many across the state would say, there has been a crime. If Mr. Hunter won't prosecute, perhaps Mr. Prater, perhaps Mr. Kunzweiler, perhaps one of the district attorneys in the state, certainly the district attorneys that have jurisdiction over the Tar Creek site. They would have been prosecuted. Crimes were committed, and they were covered up. That is inexcusable.
15 seconds, Mr. Hunter. Do you have any response?
Again, 4 prosecutors looked at this case. The arrogance and effrontery to second guess 4 of the best prosecutors in the state, 2 are Democrats, 2 are Republican. One's a former president of the District Attorney's Council and former chairman of the Ethics Commission. And again, to second guess judgment by these prosecutors that there were crimes committed, I just don't think it's fair to them. I rely on a great team that I'm very proud of, and I relied on their advice.
Thank you very much. Well, I don't know who said that, but we'll be able to chat after the debate. Bar will be open. Okay, Mr. Coburn, you have a question for Mr. Drummond.
Mr. Drummond, this campaign's TV advertisements have been quite negative. Mr. Drummond, you have repeatedly referred to Mr. Hunter as a swamp lobbyist because he worked in Washington for organizations that support life insurance and banking sectors. Why does that make him more beholden to special interests than you, an attorney who has represented corporate clients in various sectors?
Thank you for the question. I mentioned that my mother, maybe I didn't, my mother made me dance ballet when I was in middle school and high school. So I got lots of fights on the playground. I'd be out there, somebody tapped me on the shoulder, I'd turn around, they hit me in the face. So when you hit me in the face, I learned I could just lay down and cry, and it happened tomorrow and the next day, or I could hit back. The day I announced that afternoon was the ugliest of emails circulated by the Hunter campaign accusing me of accepting and being controlled by dark money, which was a bold-faced lie. I have yet to accept 1 penny from a PAC, from a special interest group, from a lobbyist. If you look at his filings, he's accepted over $50,000 already. So in response to that, I think I can stand on that higher ground. As it relates to his role in Washington, D.C., President Trump came into office and he's going to drain the swamp of lobbyists, and he's done that. We've got an attorney general who was there. Now, when you want to be a public servant, be a public servant. But once you go to D.C. to sell yourself as a lobbyist, you become disqualified.
Real quick, you said as of today you have yet to accept. You mean today as in June 23rd, or do you mean today as before the filings?
Today, as in as I breathe and walk.
Thank you. James, you have a slightly
Miss-
differently phrased follow-up from Ms. Bodilla.
Yes, Ms. Bonilla, you have watched as your opponents have attacked each other on television. What do you think about their ads?
I don't know them personally. I've met them today, Mr. Drummond, for the first time. I've met Mr. Hunter a couple of times before. I find that it's very disheartening. I find that it's a smokescreen. Let's take a look at these individuals. Let's take a look at everyone sitting up here. Look what they've done and make a decision based upon that. You know, all of these advertisements are always going to be geared towards or against a specific person. I want you to make a decision based upon our running records, our history, and not about the slander that comes across the TV or the news, the advertisements that actually makes us look like we're, perfect people in this world.
Thank you very much. James, I'm going to phrase this because I realize I may have had a word wrong. Mr. Hunter, same kind of question. What is your response to what Mr. Drummond said? But also, why have you made negative statements toward him? Why have people been running negative ads against him, questioning his ethics?
Well, the first blow, if you will, that was struck in this race was below the belt when I was dragged before the state election board and my legal residency was challenged. My grandparents, my parents are buried in this state. I'm a fourth-generation Oklahoman. I have worked very hard on behalf of the state during my career, both here and in Washington, D.C. So, Frank Keating and I represented the country's life insurers, many of which have a very significant footprint in this state. Subsequent to that, we represented the nation's bankers. So great companies like American Fidelity, Kemper, Bank First, Bank of Oklahoma, MidFirst, thousands of Oklahomans were employed by these entities. And to characterize our work on behalf of those companies and those employees as something other than honorable is something I take very personally.
But why have there been negative statements questioning Mr. Drummond's ethics? I mean,
So as a lawyer, I've got a responsibility, you have a responsibility to a jury to provide them a case, the facts and the evidence. And sometimes the facts and the evidence aren't unpleasant. In this case, the jury is the Republican primary voter. And I've got a responsibility to present to them what are relevant facts relating to Mr. Drummond's background. We've done that. Everything that we have published is substantiated by court records or newspaper reports, and I stand by our approach to this race. It's important for the public to know that there are differences.
Thank you. Aaron, I believe you have our final question. We're gonna, if we get more sponsors, we'll buy more microphones. So we'll.
This is for General Hunter. Again, Governor Mary Fallin has requested that all Oklahoma law enforcement agencies account for untested rape kits. A task force was created to look into that matter. Through this, though this campaign appears to have politicized the issue, what role, if any, do you believe the AG's office should play in determining what should be done with these 7,000 plus untested rape kits?
So the governor's task force was something that one of my staff members was appointed to. The task force was going nowhere. My employee, who's head of our victim services unit, volunteered to begin to assist and staff the task force. That happened in very recent times. Unfortunately, one of the members of the task force has a view that it's my task force, that I have command and control responsibility over law enforcement in this state. I don't. The commission needs to finish its work. The legislature needs to come up with funding. It's going to be incredibly it's going to be incredibly expensive to get all of these kits tested. But I think it's as important a priority as the legislature has going into the next session. And my commitment is to assist the legislature in finding money to get those tested.
Mr. Drummond, Barron has a
I'm
slightly
gonna
separate.
change the question a bit for you, Mr. Drummond. The task force member that A.G. Hunter was referring to as Danielle Tudor, she put out a press release and held a press conference with you during the last meeting of the task force before the task force released any of its recommendations. Do you feel that was appropriate, and why?
I would take exception with your characterization. It wasn't a joint press release. You and I were there. I never spoke to the microphone. I have a lot of respect for Danielle Tudor. I've never been raped. She has. She has a voice that needs to be heard, and it's been effectively shut down. In response to Mr. Hunter's answer, what we call that in the Osage is an excuse. He stands behind the fact that he's the chief law enforcement officer. The Attorney General is the chief law enforcement officer of the state of Oklahoma. Own it. When the governor forms a task force, lead it. If you can't lead it, then withdraw. Give it to Mr. Prater. Give it to somebody. We needed leadership. We've not gotten it. He now says it's the legislature's problem to fund. The Attorney General's office in Tennessee applied for and got a $3 million grant from the federal government. Multiple attorneys generals across the United States have done that. He has not. I don't understand this. In January, we have an opportunity for a new leader.
Let me just clarify, if I may, though. During that last meeting, you were going to have a press conference with Ms. Tudor, and you would ask to be interviewed by my TV station as well. Were you trying to politicize these rape kits?
No, what you just heard in my response is exactly what I would have told you had you put the microphone in front of me. We need leadership. It is abhorrent to me, as the husband of a woman, the father of women, the grandfather of young women, that we are not testing the rape kits. I have no criticism of law enforcement. They have done their job. We have failed as a state through our leadership to fund the testing. That DNA goes into the database, and several in this room, the perpetrator before they rape you will get caught if we can respect and honor the women of this state.
You said, I want to chime in real quick. You said you have no criticism of law enforcement, but if I'm not mistaken, several law enforcement agencies have not actually turned over their rape kits, or they had not as of a little bit ago. Is that correct?
I think what you're confusing is several did not respond to the audit. They
That's
still
what I
have
mean,
them.
yes.
It's evidence. They have it in the control room. They just haven't responded to the audit. And in defense of those, of which I live in one, Hominy, America, the chief of police turned over. I mean, these small rural communities need leadership from the Attorney General's office and some assistance. So it's no pejorative comment to these rural law enforcement agencies. They just need state leadership, which we are failing.
Ms. Bonilla, as a public defender, what is your take on this?
I think that every voice needs to be heard. And one of the main issues we have is not testing rape kits. It leaves these individuals, these victims, in limbo and in fear. I don't like the fact that we have an ability to kind of free them from that fear, and we're not doing it. I think that we need to look into funding and have these rape kits tested. It's imperative that we take a stand and say that we're going to do this for you and give you your life back, hopefully with results that we can prosecute people for doing these crimes.
Aaron.
But Ms. Bonilla, is it the role of the Attorney General's office to do that?
I believe it's our role to at least try to figure out the funding and get this going. It's the role of the prosecuting attorney in every county to be able to prosecute if we do find somebody that the tests match up with. That's all I got.
Thank you.
Mr.
AG
Hunter. So I went to see Robert Henry one time, the Attorney General, when I was in the state legislature. I needed his help on something, and I could tell General Henry was having a bad day. So I went over the details of what it was I was hoping he could help me with. And he very patiently listened, and then he looked at me and exclaimed, "Hunter, I will help you if you will promise not to get mad at me for trying to help you." So The governor's task force was going nowhere. In the last several months, my Victims Services Unit coordinator got involved to help staff it. We're committed to helping the commission fulfill its mission. I'm sorry there's been misunderstandings about our role.
If I could just clarify, you've mentioned twice now that the commission was going nowhere. What do you mean?
Well, I've agreed with some of the things Governor Fallon's done. I've disagreed with some. There was a real lack of energy and staffing that was being provided to the commission. Again, we saw there was a problem. Our Victim Services Coordinator stepped up to begin to help staff it, and that's where we are with regard to it. We've got to get these kits tested. It's going to cost a lot of money, but as I said, as far as I'm concerned, there ought to be no bigger priority to the legislature than providing the funding for law enforcement entities to get these rape kits tested.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're at the end of our questions. I know we've gone over our time a little bit. Fortunately, it's the afternoon, and you guys have doors to knock, right? No. So we're going to go to our closing statements. 2 minutes to each of you. We're going to go in the same order we did at the beginning. Mr. Drummond, you have the first closing statement.
Thank you. I certainly respect Ms. Bonilla's exercising of her rights as a citizen of Oklahoma for running, and she adds a voice to this debate. I have no criticism of Mike Hunter as an individual. He's just the wrong man for the job. I've spent a lifetime of service. First as a fighter pilot fighting in the Gulf War. Then as a community leader leading the Boy Scouts and the American Red Cross and numerous nonprofits. My wife and I have raised millions of dollars for those entities. And I've spent a career as a businessman building banks, building companies, providing jobs for 500 employees, and for 23 years as an aggressive litigator who has seen every aspect of law. As a prosecutor, I'm the only one at the table who's prosecuted. As a complex civil litigator, I'm the only one at the table that's got that skill set. I want to go back to a quick story that I think illustrates the difference between me and the choices you have. The first mission of the Gulf War, I led 75 strike jet fighters into the southeast corner of Baghdad, successfully pushing out bad guys, delivering ordnance on target and leaving. As I was almost back to Saudi Arabia, I was directed to go north to kill. I ran the intercept, I found the bad guy 100 miles out, and I began my intercept. 1.7 Mach, 30,000 feet, ready to kill. Order to kill, it wasn't right. Second order to kill, didn't do it, it wasn't right. Third order to kill, I did not do it. I knew the right thing. And the right thing was, this was not a bad guy. I ran an intercept and brought home a friendly. Was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. This is the distinction. I put career and life before me. I chose mission over personal safety. The Attorney General must put the state of Oklahoma first, not the next election, not the next political appointment, not the opportunity to make millions of dollars in Washington, D.C. Oklahoma first. When you go to the poll on Tuesday, you have the opportunity to put Oklahoma first. Vote for me.
Thank you, sir. Mrs. Bonilla, your 2-minute closing statement.
Thank you. I want to thank you all for giving me the opportunity to speak on my behalf. You see, I'm living my own David and Goliath story. The thing about my job that I love the most is I have freedom. Freedom to inform my clients about every aspect of the law, about every aspect of the possible outcome of their case. And in giving them this freedom, I don't sugarcoat anything. I don't tell them what they want to hear. I am not going to regurgitate propaganda. I research the issues and I ask questions when necessary. I believe that every individual in Oklahoma needs to be properly informed without sugarcoating, without double talk. You know, I'm not like these Goliaths, although I've fought many Goliaths in my lifetime. I stand before you not saying that I'm a perfect person, because my own life choices can prove that I'm not. But I'm telling you that I'm a perfect person for this job. I will fight for everyone in Oklahoma. I will fight with integrity, with transparency. I will fight with respect and understanding. I ask for you to stand with me at the polls on Tuesday and vote for me, Angela Bonilla, for your next Attorney General. Thank you.
And Mr. Hunter, final 2 minutes to you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Savage, and panelists, thank you. I was hoping that the questions would be more in the nature of multiple choice or true false. Election coming up next week. I think I can speak for my two colleagues on the stage that we're going to be happy when Tuesday gets here. The responsibility that you all have as voters is to thoughtfully and objectively evaluate the candidates who are vying for the Republican nomination for Attorney General in this state. I have a record, and my team in the AG's office has a record that we think commends itself favorably to the voters of the state. We've protected you, whether it's getting fraudsters and scam artists off the street and getting restitution back to victims, whether it's putting child pornographers in prison, whether it's getting a handle on corruption and abuse and mismanagement in state government, whether it's the botched Glossop execution, which our grand jury evaluated, and we now understand what happened. We've got a great new director in Joe Albaugh, whether it was the health department, where the mess was determined to be a $30 million appropriation that wasn't necessary. There's a new team in place there. We're optimistic about it getting turned around, but not in time to regulate the 788 state question process. I get up every morning and go to bed every night with one priority, and that's keeping you safe. You have to remember in these jobs that you've got a responsibility not only holistically to the people of the state, but to every individual. Whether it's the student that didn't get her scholarship because of silliness at her high school, whether it's the guy who was in prison, wrongfully in prison for 15 years that wasn't getting his recompense because of a technicality, whether it's the lieutenant, Michael Behenna, who was falsely charged, I think, and convicted, who needs to be pardoned. You have to remember that every individual has dreams, families, friends, and hopes, and you have to protect those as Attorney General. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Round of applause for all of our candidates. Thank you guys for being here. I do want to say that I really appreciate these candidates, all the other candidates who've come to our other debates. This is something that Oklahoma needs. Whether non-doc continues to exist for the next 10 years or not, we need the chance to hear from the people who want to represent us. And so I hope you will continue to support these debates and others as they may come up. Thank you. Real quick round of applause to the journalists. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Brianna. Thank you, James. We're all excited Tuesday's coming here as well.